Welcome to Psychology Ninjas. Today it's the turn of Watson and Rayner, which is our classic study for learning theories. So, how are you going to access AO1 or explanation marks? Well, this is a study, so that means aim, procedure, findings and conclusions. Make sure you're selecting details that you can later use for evaluation. So, when we're thinking about this, you want the aim to be about the emotional responses being acquired through classical conditioning. You could go one step further here and talk about fear being the acquired response. Within the procedure, the key element to talk about here is that this is a pre-experiment, not a case study. I repeat, not a case study. That's because Watson and Rayner directly manipulated the IV. They presented those different stimuli to little Albert. However, because it is only one participant, that's the pre-bit. You also want to talk about here the baseline emotional responses were tested and that little Albert showed no responses to the stimuli. You can then work through each of the 5 sessions explaining what happened. For the findings, I would go back to before, during and after conditioning as a process that we've already learned in relation to classical conditioning. 2 conclusions here, that it was relatively easy to condition the emotional response of fear, but also stimulus generalisation was demonstrated, that Albert started with a fear of white fluffy rats, but that was then generalised across lots of different white fluffy objects. Okay, so when we're thinking about evaluate, we're on that middle set of ideas in terms of this being a grave evaluation. When we're thinking about this, we want to break this down, making sure that we develop logical chains of reasoning, either through presenting arguments and counter-arguments or developing our ideas. You want to ensure that you frame these with a state, explaining what your point is, and also a mini conclusion or a link as we show here. How does this break down to this evaluate 8 marker? Well, we suggest you start by explaining the aim and the participants. This could be the fact that this was a pre-experiment. Then you can move through and explain that the study was not representative, partly because it was one participant, but also Albert was selected because he was emotionally stable, and that may not represent all people. You can also talk about this being an ethnocentric study. You can also talk about this being an ethnocentric study. That actually fears may be responding to environmental stimuli, and we may have evolved to have different fears in different countries. For example, spiders in Australia, not great. Overall, your mini conclusion here is that the findings of this study may have low generalisability because of the nature of the sample. You're then moving through and talking about the procedure, those sessions 1 to 5 and what happened. You're evaluating this with a standardised procedure, that Watson and Rayner had a highly controlled environment, and that also the blocks were checked in later sessions to see that this wasn't just a general fear response that Albert was showing to everything presented, because the same fear response was not shown to the blocks as it was to the white fluffy objects. You can counter this here by saying there were variations in how the stimuli were presented, that actually the rabbit was placed but the dog was pushed in front, and this might explain why there were various different responses for Albert. Overall, this has high internal reliability because of that standardised procedure. From here, move through to the findings and explain their application. This is all exactly the same as it was when we talked about classical conditioning. Then we're going to split the conclusions up into conclusion 1 about fear responses, and then counter this by saying there's a lack of ecological validity because it was an artificial environment. I would talk about this being a controlled or a lab observation rather than anything else because observations link in nicely to learning theories. We can say that there was high control over extraneous variables, and overall, although external validity was low, internal validity is high. You're then going to talk about conclusion 2 with stimulus generalisation and talk about ethical problems. That little Albert's parent worked in the same hospital and may have felt pressurised to participate in the study. However, big thing here, although Albert cried, this was proportional to everyday harm, and therefore protection from harm wasn't a massive issue for this study. Also, some accounts say that Albert was withdrawn from the study early and that Watson and Rayner intended to decondition him as well. Overall, ethical guidelines were met. Okay, let's move on to look at some exam questions. Here we've got a 2-mark explain question, and we're focusing in on the conclusions for this study. This means that nothing else about that procedure or even the findings are relevant. We're focusing in on 2 specific, clear and definitive conclusions. Okay, let's move on to an 8 marker. Here we've got a slightly different command word, to what extent. This is asking us to form judgments, and you might want to start off your response with a judgment about how useful this classic study is in explaining human behaviour. This looks a little bit scary, but is actually still breaking down into exactly what you've done before. Thanks for joining us today here at Psychology Ninjas. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell. See you next time.